Hi, this is Mario with the DMC, and today we'll be learning how to animate text with hair applied, a nice material applied as well. We'll go over some basic keyframe animation, hair dynamics, OpenGL preview, and the final render settings. Okay, so our very first step is to make a path. There are a couple ways of doing that. We can go down to the menu at the bottom and add, or you can use the shortcut Shift-A. The next step is to go into edit mode with tab, and we're going to move these control points around. You'll notice that I have snapping on, which will make things a little easier. That way I can move the control points using increment as the snap element, and we can have some more even curvature to our curve. I'll just drop a control point and hit E for extrude, and that way I can extrude the curve out and add some more control points. Right now I'm making the S. You'll notice that I don't have the middle of the S quite where I want it, so I'll just select those control points and move it first, and then I can go into the translate in this menu here and explicitly type in -0.5 to move it in half an increment. There, the S will look a little nicer. I'm going to go ahead and quickly make the H now. I'll start with Shift-A to add, curve, and then path. And we're going to do the same process of extruding these control points and moving them around. You'll notice that I want to have this piping sort of look to the lettering. So I'm going to move some control points down at the top of the H so that it pipes around as one continuous curve to make the H. Okay, you'll notice that I have all of my letters piped out as one continuous curve per letter. I've also rotated them to face in the Y direction. So I've first used the snapping to move my 3D cursor right at the point of the S, and I'll do that later on so you can see it happen again. That way, when I add my cylinder, it will automatically be placed right at my 3D cursor. So I'm going to go ahead and make my cylinder with 32 vertices, 0.35 radius, and I'm using 18 depth with this particular letter. Of course, we're going to need some more resolution in our cylinder so that it'll hold when we use our curve modifier. So I'm going to hit tab and go into edit mode, and then with a Control R, I'm going to slice some more cuts, which will add some edges. I'm going to go ahead and add 24 edges. Okay, I'm ready to now add my curve modifier. I'll select my cylinder in object mode and go down to my modifiers and choose the curve modifier. You'll see I already have these curves labeled with their names, so I'll choose S, and I'm going to go ahead and put it in the Z direction, and you'll notice that when I move the cylinder in Z, it's going to take the place of the curve and go right into place. Okay, so I think I'm ready to move on to the H. So I'll first right click to select my H and use Shift S to snap, and I'll select 3D cursor to selected. I will then go ahead and add my cylinder with Shift A, and you'll notice that I have the triangular fan set for the cap, and I also have Create UV selected. This time I'm going to make it a little longer. It's going to be 30, and we'll see how that works. Just like before, we'll add some cuts. So I'm going to hit Tab to go into edit mode, hit Control R, loop cut and slide, and I'm going to add 40 cuts to add some more resolution. Then I'll hit Tab to go back into object mode. I will then add my curve modifier just like before, and you'll notice that when I hit Z, it's not going to go quite where I want it, so I'm going to change the deformation axis to Y, and let's see how that works. So it looks like the cylinder is a little too big, too tall, so I'm just going to go back into edit mode and select all of the faces and scale them in Z to make it a little bit shorter. And I'll probably do this a couple times back and forth to make sure that the geometry lines up with the curve. I'm going to go ahead now and create cylinders and apply the curve modifier to my other letters. And you'll notice that I might have to change the deformation axis and also scale in Z my cylinder to make everything fit right. The next thing I'm going to do is add a subdivision modifier to each of the letters, and this could potentially affect the hair that we add as well as the overall look, just make it a little smoother. When I'm done with that, I'm going to go into the shading and give it a smooth shading. Okay, as you can see, I have all of my letters ready to go, and I'm going to switch to the cycles renderer to get a more realistic look and also to serve our hair. And I'm going to change this timeline editor to the node editor so we can play with the materials. You'll notice I've just added a material to the S, and it's a diffuse. I'm going to add another glossy material, and we're going to mix them with a mix shader. I'll use Shift A to add, and then shader, mix shader, and plug them in together. To get a nice preview of what we've done, I hit Shift Z to go into the rendered view. And just for good measure, I'm going to select all the faces and hit Assign. So I assign my new material to my S. And lastly, I'm going to move the light source over so we can get a nice look at our mixed material. You can kind of see the glossy reflection on the S. I'm going to go into the world and lighten up the background so you get a nice look of the S. And then I'm going to go in and tweak our material a little bit. So it's a little boring right now, so it's time to add some texture. So I'm going to add a Voronoi texture. And I'm going to set it to cellular and plug that directly into the diffuse shader. Let's see what that looks like. So you'll notice by default the Voronoi texture has lots of different colors. So I'm going to use a color remap node, and I'm going to show you where that is. It's going to be under Converter, Color Ramp, and you'll see it remaps the colors to a black and white gradient. I'm going to go ahead and choose some colors here to make it more interesting, make it pink. And I'm going to change the interpolation to constant, so I have these nice sort of blocks of color. I'm going to add one more white color here. Okay, that's starting to look a little more interesting. You'll notice right now we have these cellular, shapes, and they're kind of stretched along this S here. Blender is actually using the generated coordinate space, and we can change that. So I'm going to go into Add Input Texture Coordinate, and let's right now I'll show you with generated. It doesn't change because it's the default. So we're actually going to use UV. I'm going to plug UV into our coordinates, and you'll see the look changes a little bit. And you'll notice that the UVs that we generated when we made the cylinder are going to be there. So I'm going to go to UV editor, and you can see these are the default UVs, and so that's what it's using for the texture space. So actually, that big block, the body of the cylinder, the UVs are quite short, so it's going to be stretching our texture, which may or may not be what you want, but that's what we're going to use today. And we're going to add some vector mapping. This is going to change the mapping of our UV. So I'm going to rotate it around a little bit just to get the look I want. And change the scale. And you'll notice that our glossy material still is using white. There's no texture on our glossy material. But in the meantime, I'm going to call this material pink cells. And I'm going to plug in our texture into the glossy material. So let's see what happens. So I plug that in, and you'll see it gets a lot brighter because we're getting both of those shaders mixed together. And I'm going to add a color and brightness contrast node. That way our glossy color is still going to be brighter. So when it's reflecting lights or the environment, those reflections are going to be brighter and more vibrant with using this brightness contrast node. Okay, just really quickly, I'm going to show you how to copy our pink cells material to the other letters. So the first thing I'm going to do is select H-A-R-I-N-G. So that's shift right click, H-A-R-I-N-G, and then I'm going to go to the S, select the S last, and then under materials, I'm going to go to copy material to others. So once again, I'm going to do that again, copy material to others, and you'll see all of our letters now have the pink cells material. You can also see in the materials there's a 7, and that means that 7 objects are sharing this one pink cells material. Okay, I think we're ready to add some hair. So I'm going to go ahead and select S, and then in my properties pane over here, I'm going to switch to the particles tab, and I'm going to go ahead and select new, and I'm going to change the type from emitter, which is the normal particles, to hair, which is going to give me some hair. You'll see I have quite a lot of hair, so I'm going to take down the number to 300 and make them a little shorter to 1. So these are our 300 hairs here, and you'll see them. They're quite thin. So the next thing I'm going to do is go to this setting down here and cycle hair settings, and I can change the thickness. This only works for the cycles renderer. So for the thickness, the root, I'm going to change it to 8, and the tip is going to be 2. So now I'm going to go to the preview render, and you'll see our hairs are a lot thicker now. And they look quite spiky now. Let's add some more so it actually looks like hair. So let's go into children, and if I go into simple, simple is going to add a bunch of children hair right next to our original 300 hairs. Interpolated, on the other hand, is going to add a bunch of children in between each of our original hairs. Gives you a little bit more realistic of a look. You'll notice that under display, this setting is going to dictate how many we see in this preview render mode. So I'm going to bring it down to 5. or I'll bring it up to 20, and you can see how that changes in our preview render. And you'll see it under display is render. So it would actually render a lot more hairs if I were to actually hit render in the render settings. Under kink, we have lots of different options. Curl is going to give us a nice curl to each of our hairs. And there's other options like radial, wave, braid, which looks pretty neat, spiral. But I think for now we're just going to keep it on curl, and I'm going to bring the amplitude down to 0.15, so we just have a little bit of a curl to our hairs. So right now you'll notice that we're doing line segments under Cycle's hair settings, and if we change that to curve, it's actually going to have a more fluid curve to our look. So this is line segments. You'll see how kind of choppy it looks, but if we do go to curve segments, it'll give a curve to each of our hairs. And we can also up the resolution of the curve. So I'm going to drive it up to 5, so we have this nice realistic curve to our hair. That's going to add to the render time just a little bit, but it looks nicer. Okay, so now I'm going to make a nice setting for the particles and apply it to my other letters so they all share the same setting. I'm going to increase the hairs to 350 and do some more fine tuning. Under children, I'm going to set the render setting to the same as display, which is 8. That way when I render, it's going to give me exactly what I see right now, which is what I want. In other cases, you might want to have more hair at render time, but I like the way it looks as is. I'm going to give this setting a name. Shaggy hair. And I think I'm ready to apply it to the other letters. So I'll select H, under particles, select new, and I'll just switch the setting to shaggy hair. And I'll repeat this step for the other letters. Okay, so we can see the hair on all of the letters, and you'll see that there's a 7, which means 7 of the objects are sharing this same particle setting. And if I make any changes to shaggy hair, you'll see it automatically updates to all of the objects which have that same setting applied. And I'm just going to make some changes to the material. And if we remember, all 7 of the objects and the hair have the same pink cell material. So I'll just do some fine tweaking, and then we'll be ready for the next step. Okay, one of the things I forgot to mention was with our particle setting, right now we have use modifier stack disabled. So right now the hair is going to be emitted from the original base geometry. If I click this use modifier stack, you'll see that some hair starts to protrude out from the base and tip of the S. That's because it's using the subdivision modifier output to determine which faces to emit from. So when I smooth the base and tip of the S, it's going to add some more faces at an angle rather than going straight to 90 degrees. So you'll start to see the hair getting emitted from the base and tip a little more. So that's something to keep in mind that you might want to use is that setting use modifier stack, especially if your subdivision modifier is really drastic. If it's a lot higher of a setting, then you'll want to maybe have your hair emitted from the resulting geometry. So for now, I think I'm just going to leave use modifier stack unchecked. And this is going to be the basic animation. that we're going to do is moving the geometry away from the curve, which is modifying it. And that's how we're going to animate each of these letters to jump into place here. So first off, I'm going to move my camera using a combination of the this transform and typing it in, and using the handles. I'm just going to pull it back and rotate it on X to 90. Move it back here. If I hit 0 on the numeric keypad, I'll go into my camera view, and then I'm just going to drag it back in Y so that I have all the letters in place here. So when I hit render, it's going to render from this camera. Okay, I think that's a good position there. And I think I'm ready to start animating these letters. So first I'm going to select the S, and I have my timeline editor at the bottom here ready to go. And just give you a preview, this is kind of what it's going to look like. And I'm going to take about 45 frames, which is a second and a half, to animate each letter in. So I'm going to move the timeline to 45, and then I'm going to insert with hitting I, inserting a location keyframe. Then I'm going to go to 0, and I'm going to move the S geometry out of sight and insert I location keyframe there. So you see I have 2 keyframes, and after 45 frames, a second and a half, it's done animating. Then I'm going to move my timeline to 65, which is 20 frames later, 2/3 of a second later, and I'm going to set a keyframe on my H. And then I'm going to move 45 keyframes before that and insert a keyframe on my H out of sight. So basically, what's going on here is each letter is taking 45 frames to complete its animation, and each letter is offset from the previous letter by 20 frames, which is 2/3 of a second. So you kind of have to think in frames. I'm rendering this final video at 30 frames per second. So I'm just trying to have enough animation within a reasonable amount of time. So it looks interesting, but it's not dwelling on a certain animation, and to have some consistency with each letter. So for example, you wouldn't want one of the letters to all of a sudden take 3 times as much time to animate than the other letters. It would look odd. So I'm just going to go ahead and finish animating the rest of these letters. So we're almost done with this animation, and just to add a little bit more interest, I'm going to go ahead and enable hair dynamics, which is going to use physics to make the hair interact with gravity and with motion and other forces. So I'll just click hair dynamics to enable it. I'll select my S, select hair dynamics, and you'll see I have this vanilla setting already saved. We'll go over some of the settings there. So I actually have to enable this on every letter. It doesn't come along with the shaggy hair preset. So I have mass at 0.3, stiffness at 0.5, damping at 0.5, and air drag at 1. Air drag is going to give it the look that you'll see. Quality is going to give a more accurate simulation if you raise that number, but it'll take more time to calculate. So I'm going to hit play, and we can see the hair kind of move around, and it looks interesting. You'll notice if you look at the very top part of the A, when the hair is simulated and it jumps around that really tight angle, it has kind of some strange behavior to it. So we'll have to make some changes there. So go ahead and pay close attention to the top of the A. And you'll see it jumps pretty abruptly. So if we look at the top of the A again, and it's not too bad, but to remedy that sort of situation where things don't look very smooth, I'm just going to increase the quality here to 20. And you'll notice that when I play it back, the frames per second is going to slow down in the preview. It's quite low. It's at 7 frames per second right now. But it's going to give us a more accurate simulation. One of the things that's very important in your animation is timing. So before we've been viewing it at around 7 frames per second. Actually, we need to see it at its final 30 frames per second speed. So if we go to render, and you'll see there's some open GL render animation settings, and it's called a play blast in other programs, but it will give you a preview at the correct pace and timing. So it'll take some of the settings from your render settings. That's why I put in the end frame at 200. And it also will use the output directory to save. So I'm going to change that. I'm going to use desktop. And the name of each frame is going to be hair temp. And then I'm going to create a folder on the desktop to put all of these frames in. And I'll call that hair temp as well. And I'll just choose that folder. So all of our preview frames are going to get rendered out to this location. So I'll hit accept, and I'll make sure my output is going there. And let's go to render, and we're going to go to OpenGL render animation. Once I do that, it's going to use the frame range I set in my render settings, and it's going to go through and render each frame. And when it's done, it's not going to really alert you or anything. You'll have to hit escape to go back to the previous menu. But to play it back, we'll go to render and play rendered animation. So now you can see the 30 frames per second timing. Okay, I think we're ready to start rendering using the render settings and our camera for the final output. So this is our camera view. And I'm going to go ahead and hit render so we can take a look. So it's not too bad. It's running pretty quickly. You'll notice the background is gray, which will change later. And the final time it takes to render this image is going to be 24 seconds, which is not too bad. Or excuse me, 29 seconds. All right, let's get rid of this background. So the way we do that, in our render settings, we'll go down to Film and click the Transparent checkbox. And I think it's safe to go all the way to 100%, so I'm going to raise this to 100% of the width, which is 1920 by 1080. And let's hit render and see how long that takes. Okay, that one took 1 minute and 40 seconds. So we're getting a little bit longer. There's 250 frames here, so that's going to end up taking all night to render, which is expected. So I think we can turn it up a little bit and add some motion blur, which is really going to give some realism to our little hairs that are flying around, and when our letters fly into place, they will blur according to how quickly they're moving. So I'm going to click this checkbox, motion blur. We'll keep the shutter at 0.5. And let's hit render to get a preview. You'll notice I chose a frame where things are moving quite a lot, so we can really see the effect of the motion blur. Okay, so you'll see the eye starting to blur, and it's not taking that much longer to render, which is kind of nice. So you'll see all the hairs are blurring together in the eye. So I think it's safe to keep the motion blur setting on. And let's look at the final time. It took 1:30. This frame doesn't have every letter, so it's going to take a little less time, but then it's also adding time with the motion blur, so that's why it's not quite 1:40 and it's at 1:30 with motion blur. So I think we're ready to go. And one thing to note is if you plan on using network render, you'll have to bake the simulation, so you'll have to make a cache for all of the particles. I'm not going to go over that in this video. Well, there you have it. That's the final result, and I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and thanks for watching.